Welcome, dear listener, to this quiet corner of time, where stories are not told in haste, but carried gently, like embers glowing in the deep of night. Settle in. Let your body soften, your breath slow, as if the world outside has agreed to hold its breath just for you. If you're ready, close your eyes. Feel the weight of your limbs sinking into stillness, as though the mattress beneath you remembers every journey you've ever taken, and now says, rest, you are safe here. Breathe in slowly. Let the air fill your chest like a tide rising over a quiet shore. Breathe out and release the day, the noise, the thoughts that cling like shadows. Let them drift away, not with force, but with the quiet ease of leaves carried by a river. Tonight, we travel to a small village nestled on the edge of a fractured land, France. A kingdom torn by war, divided by crowns and blood, where the future was written not in promises, but in battles yet to come. But far from the clamor of armies, in a quiet clearing where cows graze and wildflowers bend in the breeze, there is a girl. She walks barefoot through the tall grass, her hands brushing the stems, feeling the dew before dawn. The sky above is pale, the stars fading like distant memories. Smoke curls from the chimneys of wooden homes. A rooster calls. The scent of bread baking in a clay oven drifts through the air. This is Domrémy, a place untouched by banners or conquest. A place where a child grows up hearing something no one else can, a whisper in the wind, a voice in the rustle of leaves, a presence in the light that falls through the trees. And her name? It is Jeanne, though the world will later call her Joan. Jeanne d'Arc, a name that will one day echo through cathedrals and history books, whispered by soldiers, painted by artists, spoken in prayers. But right now, she is not a legend. She is not a saint. She is not even a soldier. She is simply a girl who listens. And if you've ever thought that hearing voices might be a sign you should see a doctor, well, sometimes it's just the beginning of a very unusual career. This is not a story of swords alone. It is not about glory or conquest or the thunder of hooves on battlefield soil. This is a story about listening, about a young soul who, instead of turning away from what frightened her, leaned in, who, when told she was wrong, said quietly, "But I know what I heard," and who, without seeking to be a hero, became one simply by following a voice that no one else believed in except her, and perhaps a few saints who had apparently decided she was worth a visit. If you've ever felt a quiet pull inside you, if you've ever sensed a path that makes no logical sense, yet feels true, then this story is also yours. Not because you're meant to lead an army, but because you, too, may have heard something in the dark, something soft, something persistent, something that says, you are needed, even when you feel the least qualified to be. Before we walk deeper into her world, into the fields, the forests, the silent prayers whispered under moonlight, I want to thank you. Thank you for being here, for choosing this moment of stillness, for letting history breathe softly into your ears as you prepare to sleep. If you listen from a city lit by street lamps, from a cabin in the mountains, or from a bed near the sea, know that you are not alone. Thousands around the world are closing their eyes to these same stories, carried by the same wind that once passed through a young girl's hair in a forgotten village. If this space brings you peace, if these voices from the past help you rest, please consider subscribing. It helps more people find their way here, to this calm, this warmth, this gentle journey through time. And if you feel like it, leave a comment with where you're listening from tonight. We read every one, like letters from distant friends. Now let us step forward quietly into the life of a girl who changed a kingdom, not with a crown, but with a whisper. Let us walk with her, not as a legend, not as a saint or a soldier, but as a human being, one who listened when no one else would. And as we begin, remember, sometimes the loudest revolutions start in silence. And sometimes all it takes is one girl, a few saints, and a very strong opinion about who should be king. Long before her name was spoken in the halls of kings, before it was carried on the wind across battlefields, or whispered in prayer by trembling lips, there was a world that turned slowly beneath a sky untouched by urgency. It was a world shaped not by dates or decrees, but by the quiet rhythm of living, the way the sun warmed the soil at dawn, the way the cows lowed softly as they were led to pasture, the way smoke curled from chimneys like thoughts rising from a dreaming mind. This was France, not as a nation drawn in ink on a map, but as a feeling in the bones of those who walked its soil, a presence in the wind that moved through the tall grass and the ancient trees that had stood for centuries, their roots deep in stories no one remembered anymore. The war had been going on for generations, not as a single conflict, but as a long, slow unraveling of peace, a thread pulled from the fabric of life, until the whole kingdom seemed to hang by a single breath. Kings claimed thrones they had never seen. Armies marched under banners that meant different things to different people. And in the villages far from the courts and the castles, people lived as if history were something that happened elsewhere, something that arrived only in rumors, in silence, in the way a father looked at his daughter a little longer than usual before she went to bed. The land was divided, not just by borders, but by fear. In the north, English lords ruled with cold authority, their soldiers stationed in towns where the people still spoke French and dreamed in colors that did not belong to foreign crowns. In the south, a fragile hope lingered around a man called the Dauphin, a prince without a kingdom, waiting in shadows for a sign that it was time to step forward. But far from the courts and the battlefields, life continued in quiet persistence, shaped by the seasons, by the weather, by the simple acts of survival that defined each day. In villages like Domrémy, nestled between forests and rivers, the war was something heard about, not lived. It arrived in the form of travelers who spoke of sieges and betrayals, in the sudden absence of a young man who had gone to fight and never returned, in the way parents spoke in low voices after supper, as if the walls themselves might carry their words to enemies. The people here were not soldiers or nobles. They were farmers, shepherds, mothers who needed bread at dawn, fathers who mended fences with hands shaped by years of work. Their world was small, but it was whole. The sun rose. The animals needed tending. The fire had to be kept alive. And in that repetition, there was a kind of holiness, a quiet devotion to the ordinary that held the world together. There were no clocks, but the body knew time. The rooster's call was the first voice of the day, followed by the creak of wooden doors, the splash of water from the well, the soft shuffle of bare feet on cold earth. Women walked to the river with baskets on their hips, their skirts brushing the dew-covered grass, their breath visible in the morning air. Men carried tools over their shoulders, their boots heavy with mud, their faces marked by sun and wind. Children ran ahead, laughing, their voices brief and bright, like sparks from a fire that vanish before they can be caught. Smoke rose from chimneys, like slow prayers sent into the sky, and the scent of baking bread drifted through the village, warm and familiar, a promise that today, at least, there would be food. Rhythm was steady, almost sacred, as if each gesture honored an unspoken promise to keep going, to care for what was given, to protect what was loved. And in that rhythm, there was a kind of peace, not the peace of victory, not the peace of silence after war, but the peace of continuity, of knowing that even if the world broke, life would still find a way to grow. The land itself felt ancient, as though it had seen too much and chosen to remain silent. Trees stood like witnesses, their bark rough and cracked, their branches heavy with leaves that whispered when the wind passed through. Rivers moved with quiet purpose, carrying leaves and secrets downstream, their waters clear and cold, reflecting the sky like a mirror held up to the heavens. At night, the stars were sharp and close, and the moon cast long shadows over the fields, turning the world into a place of silver and shadow. There were no street lamps, no engines, no voices from machines. Only the crackle of fire, the distant bark of a dog, the wind moving through the tall grass like a hand brushing across a harp. And in that stillness, the mind could wander, could dream, could listen. Because when there is no noise, the world begins to speak in softer tones, in the rustle of leaves, in the hum of insects, in the way a single bird calls from a distant tree, as if sending a message meant only for one soul. Religion was not a Sunday event. It was woven into every moment, like thread through cloth. A sign of the cross before drinking water, a whispered prayer when a child coughed at night, candles lit not for decoration, but as small acts of faith, like sending light into the dark and hoping it would be seen. Churches were simple, often built from stone that had been carried by hand, their bells ringing not to call the faithful, but to mark the hours of the day, as if reminding the world that time was still passing, that God was still listening. People did not speak of miracles as if they were impossible. They spoke of them as rare, yes, but not unimaginable, as if the divine could still touch the earth, could still walk among people in times of great need. These tales were not told to impress, but to comfort, to say, even in darkness, someone is watching. Even in silence, someone is speaking. And sometimes, in the stillness between sleep and waking, a child might wonder if such things could happen again, if the sacred could still enter the world through an ordinary door, if a voice could come not from a book or a priest, but from the wind, from the light, from within. Children grew up knowing the names of saints, like old relatives Margaret, Catherine, Michael, each with a story of courage, of faith, of sacrifice. They heard of visions, of angels who appeared in fields, of voices that called from the sky. These stories were not distant. They were close, like fires in the distance, visible on a clear night. And in a world where so much was uncertain, where war could take a father, where sickness could take a mother, where hunger could take a season, these stories offered something steady, the idea that even in the smallest life there could be a purpose, that even a shepherd girl, barefoot in the grass, might be seen by something greater, that even in silence someone might be listening. And so, when a girl began to say she heard voices, it was not immediately dismissed as madness. It was met with fear, yes, with doubt, with questions, but not with laughter. Because in this world, where the line between the earthly and the divine was thin, where dreams could feel more real than daylight, such things were not impossible. They were rare. They were dangerous, but not impossible. There was no concept of changing the world. The world was too big, too broken, too far from repair. People hoped only to protect what was theirs, to keep the roof from leaking, the animals from disease, the children from war, to live and die in the same place, surrounded by familiar faces. That was peace. That was enough. And yet, in this acceptance, there was also a quiet strength, a kind of courage that did not wear armor or carry a sword, but simply endured, simply stayed, simply believed that tomorrow might be no better, but it would be lived. This was the courage of mothers who sang lullabies during thunderstorms, of fathers who walked miles to trade a chicken for salt, of children who learned to read by candlelight, their fingers tracing letters in the air. It was not loud. It did not make history, but it was real. And in that quiet, something deep was forming, not in palaces, not in armies, but in hearts that had learned to hope without proof, to love without guarantee, to believe without certainty. The seasons turned, as they always had. Winter came again, wrapping the land in stillness. Snow covered the fields, and the rivers slowed beneath a skin of ice. Smoke rose from chimneys, like prayers that never stopped. Inside homes, families gathered around fires, their faces lit by flickering light, their voices low. Stories were told, songs were hummed, hands were held. And outside, the wind moved through the trees, whispering across the frozen earth, as if searching for someone who would listen. The nights were long and the days short, but no one complained. This was the way of things. And in that acceptance, there was a kind of dignity, a knowing that life was not about comfort, but about continuity, about passing something on, even if it was only a song, a recipe, a look that said, "I am here. You are not alone." No one knew that soon a girl would step out of this world, not to escape it, but to carry its quiet truth into the roar of history. She would not come with an army. She would come with a certainty. She would not speak in riddles or threats, but in simple words, "I was sent." And though the world would try to break her, to silence her, to forget her, something in her voice would remain not as a shout, but as a murmur in the wind, a reminder that even in the darkest times, someone might still hear something no one else can. She would not be understood. She would not be welcomed. But she would be felt like a change in the air, like the first drop of rain before a storm, like a note in a song that had been missing for too long. This was the world before she spoke, before she rode, before she stood before a king and changed the course of a nation. It was not a world of grand events or famous names. It was a world of breath, of soil, of silence. A world where faith was not loud, but deep, where courage was not in victory, but in continuing. And in that stillness, something was preparing. Not with thunder, not with fire, but with the softest of movements, as when a single leaf begins to tremble before the wind arrives. It was a world that did not know it was about to be changed, not by force, not by strategy, but by the quiet insistence of a heart that believed in something invisible. So we remember this time, not as background, but as foundation, because great stories do not begin in palaces or battlefields. They begin in fields, in homes, and hearts that have learned to listen. And before there was a mission, before there was a war, before there was a name known to history, there was only this: a village, a sky, a girl who grew up believing that even the smallest voice could be heard by God. She did not ask for greatness. She did not seek power. She only listened. And in a world that had forgotten how to hear, that simple act would become revolutionary. And perhaps, by listening to this world, we come closer to understanding not just what she did, but who she was before the world needed her. A child of the earth, a dreamer in the grass, a soul shaped by silence, about to step into the storm, not because she wanted to, but because something inside her could not look away, could not stay quiet, could not pretend she hadn't heard. This was the world before the voice, before the journey, before the armor, before the fire. And in its quiet, we find the first whisper of what would come not as a command, but as a calling, soft, persistent, unseen, but real. And so we walk with her now, not as a legend, not as a saint, not as a soldier, but as a human being, standing in the grass, looking at the sky, wondering if what she feels is real. And in that moment, before the world changes, we pause, we breathe. We remember that every great journey begins not with a march, but with a breath, not with a cry, but with a thought, not with a sword, but with a heart that dares to believe. There was a girl who grew up between the rhythm of the seasons and the quiet of the fields, where the world felt close enough to touch and far enough to dream, where the sun warmed the soil in the morning and the stars returned like old friends at night, where the only sounds were the lowing of cows, the rustle of leaves, the distant ring of a church bell carried on the breeze. She was not born into power, nor into wealth, nor into the kind of name that would be remembered across centuries. She was born into the ordinary, the smell of fresh bread in the morning, the sound of her mother kneading dough at dawn, the feel of cool earth beneath her bare feet as she walked through the tall grass after rain. Her days were shaped by the sun, by the chores of the home, by the prayers whispered at night beside her mother. She helped with the animals, gathered herbs, spun wool, and listened to the stories told by the firelight tales of saints who had faced dragons, of martyrs who had walked into fire without flinching, of angels who had spoken to shepherds in the hills. These stories did not feel distant to her. They felt possible. They felt near, as if the veil between the seen and the unseen were thin in that part of the world, as if the wind itself might carry a voice meant only for one pair of ears. She was not a child of books or schools. She could not read, not in the way kings and priests could, but she could listen. And in a world where most people measured wisdom by knowledge, she carried a different kind of knowing one that lived in the chest, not the mind. It was a quiet certainty, a sense of being guided, not by logic, but by something deeper, something older. And one day, when she was 13, walking alone beneath an old oak tree at the edge of the village, she heard it for the first time. Not a sound, exactly. Not a voice like human voices, but a presence clear, warm, and unmistakable like sunlight falling across the skin. It spoke without words, yet she understood. It told her she was not alone. It told her she had a purpose. And though she did not know what that purpose was, she knew, with a calm that surprised her, that it was real. It did not frighten her. It did not overwhelm her. It simply was, like the sky above her, like the earth beneath her, like the breath in her lungs. And when it was gone, the world felt different, not because anything had changed, but because she had. At first, she did not speak of it, not because she feared disbelief, but because the experience was too intimate, too vast, to be held in language. It was like trying to describe the color of the sky to someone who had never seen blue. How could she explain that the air around her had changed, that the light had deepened, that for the first time she felt both small and significant, like a single note in a song that had been playing since the beginning of time? She carried it inside her like a secret flame, something to tend, not to show. And yet it grew, it returned, again and again, in the same place, beneath the same tree, at moments when the world was still just before dawn, just after rain, just as the sun dipped below the hills. And each time the presence became clearer, more distinct, until it began to take form. She saw figures in the light, not with her eyes, but with something deeper. A man in shining armor, with wings that shimmered like water in sunlight. A woman in a white gown, holding a lily. Another with a crown of fire. They did not frighten her. They felt like old friends, like guardians who had been waiting for her to notice them. They introduced themselves not with names shouted, but with meanings carried on the breath of the moment. Michael, Margaret, Catherine, saints, warriors, virgins, protectors of the faithful. And they spoke to her not in commands, but in assurances, in gentle truths. You are loved. You are chosen. You are not alone. They did not tell her what to do, not yet. They only prepared her, like roots growing in silence beneath the soil, like a river forming far from the sea, like a seed that knows, without understanding why, that it is meant to become a tree. She began to live with two worlds inside her, the one of bread and fire and chores, and the one of light and presence and calling. And though they seemed separate, she felt them moving together, like two threads woven into the same cloth. She still milked the cows. She still helped her mother knead dough. She still laughed with her brothers and sisters. But now there was a stillness behind her eyes, a depth in her gaze, as if part of her was always listening to something the others could not hear. Her parents noticed. They saw how she paused before speaking, how she looked at the sky as if expecting a sign, how she would kneel in prayer longer than necessary, as if holding on to a moment that was slipping away. They did not scold her. They were devout people, shaped by faith, and though they worried, they also understood that God sometimes spoke in ways that could not be explained, that sometimes a soul was touched not for glory, but for purpose. She did not seek visions. She did not pray for miracles. She only remained open, like a window left ajar in spring, waiting for the breeze. And slowly, the messages became clearer. Not in dramatic revelations, but in quiet insistences, like a melody repeated until it is memorized. The saints told her that France was suffering, that the land was broken, that the true king was not on the throne, and that she, this girl, this daughter of a farmer, this child of the earth, was to go to him. Not to fight, not to rule, but to guide, to lead him to Reims, to be crowned, to restore what had been lost. She did not understand how. She did not know the way. She had never left her village. She had never seen a king. But the certainty grew, not from ambition, but from a deep, unshakable knowing, like the certainty of the sun rising even when the sky is clouded, like the knowing that water flows downhill, not because it is told to, but because it is its nature. She did not tell many people. Only a cousin, once, in a moment of trembling honesty. Only her priest, later, with her hands folded and her voice low. And each time she spoke not with pride, not with excitement, but with the weight of something too heavy to carry alone. And each time she was met with silence, with confusion, with a kind of quiet fear, not because they thought she was lying, but because they believed her. And that was the most frightening thing of all, because if she was telling the truth, then the world was not as they thought. Then the divine could still walk among them. Then a girl could be chosen, not for what she knew, but for what she could hear. And if that was true, then everything, every war, every crown, every boundary, was not as solid as it seemed, and the ground beneath their feet was not as firm as they had believed. She began to pray more, not for courage, but for clarity, not for strength, but for peace. She asked not to be special, but to be useful, not for fame, but for faithfulness. And in the stillness of those prayers, something in her shifted. She stopped seeing herself as a girl from Domrémy. She began to feel like a vessel, like a path through which something greater could move. She did not become proud. She became more gentle, more patient, more present. She listened more. She spoke less. And when she did speak, her words carried a weight that made people pause, as if they had just heard a bell ring in the distance, one they had not noticed before, one that carried a message not in sound, but in meaning. The years passed. She grew taller. Her hands became stronger. The world around her remained heavy with war, but inside her a quiet fire burned. It did not rage. It did not demand. It simply was. And as she turned 16, then 17, the call grew stronger, more urgent. The saints no longer spoke of preparation. They spoke of action. You must go. You must leave. You must find the dolphin. And though the idea was impossible, how could a girl travel across a war-torn land? How could she speak to a king? How could she, a peasant, be taken seriously? She felt no fear, only a deep, quiet resolve, like a river that has finally found its course, like a seed that has broken through stone, not by force, but by persistence, not by noise, but by the quiet insistence of life pushing forward. She did not announce it dramatically. She did not gather an army. She simply told her uncle one day that she needed to go to a nearby town to visit a relative. And from there, she would begin. She cut her hair short, not to disguise herself out of shame, but to protect herself, to move through the world with less attention. She wore men's clothes, not to reject her womanhood, but to survive the journey, to walk through forests and villages without becoming a target. She carried little, a cloak, a knife, a letter of passage, and in her heart a certainty that no one could see, but that guided her like a star in the dark, not bright, not loud, but steady, constant, unchanging. People who met her on the road said she walked with purpose, but not with pride. Her steps were steady, her gaze calm. She did not speak much, But when she did, her words were simple, clear, and strangely convincing. She asked for directions, for food, for shelter. And though she looked like a boy, there was something in her presence that made people pause, that made them want to help her, not out of pity, but out of a quiet respect, as if they sensed they were in the presence of someone who carried a truth too pure to ignore, too bright to extinguish, too real to dismiss as madness. She did not know what awaited her. She did not know the battles, the betrayals, the fire that would one day consume her. She only knew the next step, and the next, and the next. And in that simplicity, there was a kind of holiness, a faith not in victory, but in motion, not in results, but in obedience to what she could not see, but could not unhear. And in that obedience, in that quiet yes, the world began to shift, not with thunder, not with war, but with the softest of movements, like a leaf turning toward the light, like a breath that begins a song. We do not know what it feels like to hear a voice that no one else can, but we know what it feels like to sense a path, to feel a pull, to carry a truth that others might not understand. And in her story, we are reminded that the most powerful revolutions do not begin with armies. They begin with a single heart that dares to believe in what it feels, not because it is certain, but because it has learned to listen, not because it is strong, but because it has chosen to stay open, even when the world says to close. She was still just a girl, but something in her had awakened. Not ambition, not anger, not fear, but a quiet, unbreakable knowing that she was meant for something. And though the world would try to silence her, that knowing would never leave her. It would walk with her through fire. It would speak for her when she could not. It would remain, long after her body was gone, like a whisper in the wind, still calling, still guiding, still saying, "You are not alone. You are seen. You are needed." And so we walk with her now, not as a legend, not as a martyr, not as a symbol, but as a young soul stepping forward into the unknown, guided by nothing but a voice, a vision, and the courage to listen, not because she was chosen, but because she said yes, and in that yes, the world began to change, not all at once, but molecule by molecule, like frost melting in the morning light, like a single hand reaching out in the dark, hoping to be met. There came a moment, not marked by thunder or fanfare, but by the quiet turning of a heart, when the girl who had listened beneath the oak tree began to move, not with the force of rebellion, but with the gentle insistence of a river that has gathered enough strength to leave its spring and flow toward the sea. She still woke with the sun, still helped her mother knead bread at dawn, still walked barefoot through the dew-covered grass, as she had done every morning of her life, her feet knowing the earth like memory. But now, every gesture carried a different weight, as if each step, each breath, each word was no longer just part of a day, but part of a path she could not yet see, yet could no longer ignore. The voices had become not just a presence, not just a comfort, but a direction, a current beneath her feet, pulling her forward with a calm that surprised her. They no longer spoke in generalities, in symbols, in dreams. They spoke in purpose, in clarity, in words that settled into her bones like truth. You must go. You must find the Dauphin. You must lead him to Reims. And though the words were simple, their meaning was vast, so vast that to speak them aloud felt like trying to hold the sky in her hands, like whispering a prayer so deep it could reshape the world. And yet she did not hesitate, not because she was fearless, not because she believed she was invincible, but because the fear had been replaced by something older, something deeper than fear, a knowing that had settled into her chest, not as pride, not as certainty, but as a quiet companionship, like the presence of a fire in a room when the night is long. She did not need to convince herself. She did not need to rehearse her reasons. She only needed to begin. And so, one morning, as the light touched the rooftops and the chickens stirred in their coop. She told her uncle she needed to travel to Vaucouleurs, a small town not far from her village, to visit a relative. It was not a lie, not exactly, but a veil over the truth, a way to step forward without alarming those who loved her, without facing the sorrow in her mother's eyes, the confusion in her father's voice, the fear that she was being led astray by dreams too bright to be real. She knew they would try to stop her if they understood. They would speak of danger, of war, of the impossibility of a girl walking alone through a land torn by armies. And she could not bear to see their worry, their helplessness, their quiet plea for her to stay in the world they knew, the world they could protect. She packed little, a change of clothes folded with care, a piece of bread wrapped in cloth, still warm from the oven, a knife at her side, not for fighting, but for cutting apples, for peeling bark, for feeling a little less defenseless in a world that did not welcome the vulnerable. She did not take jewels. She did not take letters of nobility. She took only what a traveler might carry, what a peasant might need. And in her heart, she carried the voices, the calm, steady presence of Michael, the gentle strength of Margaret, the wisdom of Catherine, like a fire kept alive beneath ashes, glowing even in silence, warming her from within when the night grew cold. She did not know the roads. She had never traveled far, but she trusted that if she took the first step, the next would appear, as it always had in the fields when the path was hidden by tall grass, one foot in front of the other, and the way would reveal itself, not as a straight line, but as a series of small surrenders, of quiet yeses whispered into the dark. When she cut her hair, it was not with sorrow, not with shame, but with quiet resolve, as if she were shedding a skin that no longer fit. The strands fell to the ground like leaves in autumn, soft and final, catching the light for a moment before vanishing into the earth. She did not look in the mirror. She did not mourn the girl she had been. She understood that to walk through a world at war, a girl would be seen as weak, as prey, as someone to be controlled or dismissed. But a boy, especially one who moved with purpose, who spoke with calm, who did not flinch, might pass unnoticed, might be allowed to speak, to ask, to be heard. It was not a rejection of who she was, not a denial of her body or her truth, but a protection of what she carried, a way to survive long enough to fulfill what had been asked of her. And when she looked down at her hands, still the same hands that had milked cows and gathered herbs, still marked by calluses and small scars, she felt no confusion, only clarity. The body was temporary. The mission was eternal. And for now, this was the shape it needed to take. She left at dawn, when the world was still wrapped in mist, when the stars faded slowly, like thoughts dissolving into sleep, when the air carried the scent of damp soil and distant wood smoke. The earth was cool beneath her boots. A rooster called from a distant farm. She did not look back. She did not wave. She simply walked, her breath steady, her steps measured, as if already following a rhythm that had been set long before she was born, as if her feet knew the way, even when her mind did not. The path wound through fields and forests, past streams that sang over stones, past trees whose branches reached across the road like arms offering shelter. She did not hurry. She did not rush. She moved with the patience of someone who knows that true journeys are not measured in miles, but in moments of surrender, in the quiet decisions to keep going when no one is watching, when the body aches, when the mind doubts, when the world offers no proof that the path leads anywhere at all. People she met along the way remembered her not for her appearance, not for her clothes, but for her presence, a stillness that made them pause, a calm that disarmed suspicion, a gaze that held no fear. A merchant who gave her bread said she looked like a boy, but spoke like someone older, someone who had seen things no child should carry. A woman at a well offered her water and said her eyes held a depth that made her hesitate, as if she were listening to a song no one else could hear. A guard at a village gate let her pass without question, not because her papers were perfect, but because there was something in her voice, calm, certain, unafraid, that made him trust her without knowing why. She did not try to impress. She did not demand. She only asked, and when help came, she accepted it with gratitude, as if each kindness were a small light carried forward in the dark, a reminder that even in broken times, people still remember how to be kind. She traveled for days. Nights were spent under the stars, wrapped in her cloak, listening to the sounds of the world settling into sleep, the rustle of animals in the brush, the distant howl of a wolf, the soft breath of wind through leaves. She did not light a fire. She did not sing. She simply lay there, her hands folded over her chest, her eyes open to the sky, feeling the immensity above her, feeling small, feeling held. She prayed not for safety, not for success, but for faithfulness, for the strength to remain true to what she had been given, even if no one believed her, even if she failed, even if the world forgot her name. And each morning she rose before the sun, brushed the dew from her clothes, washed her face in a cold stream, and walked again, not because she knew what waited ahead, but because she knew what waited behind. A life of silence, of unfulfilled purpose, of a voice within her that would never stop calling, no matter how many times she tried to ignore it. When she reached Vaucouleurs, she did not announce herself as a prophet. She did not claim to be sent by God. She simply asked to speak to the captain of the fortress, a man named Robert de Baudricourt, who held power in that region. She was young. She was unknown. She was dressed as a peasant boy. And yet, when she stood before him, something in her gaze made him pause. Not her words, not her claims, but the depth of her stillness, the absence of fear, the certainty that radiated from her like warmth from a fire on a winter night. She told him she had been sent by God to help the Dauphin, to lift the siege of Orleans, to lead the king to his coronation. He laughed at first, not out of cruelty, but out of disbelief. How could this girl, this child of a farmer, know anything of war or kings? How could she believe such things with such calm? But she did not flinch. She did not argue. She only repeated what she had been told, not with pride, not with excitement, but with the quiet confidence of someone who has heard a truth too deep to doubt, too real to question. And something in her voice, in her eyes, in the way she stood small, yet unshakable, made him hesitate. He did not believe her, not yet. But he could not dismiss her. So he sent her away, telling her to return to her family, to forget such dreams. But she stayed. She remained in the town, not demanding, not protesting, simply being there, day after day, like a stone in the river, unmoved by the current. She helped where she could. She spoke little. She waited. And slowly, the people began to notice. A servant said she prayed with more devotion than any noble. A soldier said her presence calmed the horses. A priest said her faith was not loud, but deep, like a well with no bottom. Weeks passed, winter lingered, and still she waited. Then, one day, she told them the Dauphin's army had lost a battle near Orleans. She did not know it from a messenger. She did not hear it from a traveler. She said she had known it, as if the news had come on the wind, carried by a presence she could not see but could not deny. And when a rider arrived days later with the same report, silence fell over the room. No one spoke. But something shifted. Not belief, not yet, but the first crack in disbelief. The idea that perhaps, just perhaps, this girl carried something real, something beyond understanding, something that could not be explained by logic or reason. She asked again to be taken to the Dauphin. This time they did not laugh. They hesitated. They consulted. They feared for her, feared for themselves, feared the consequences of aiding a mad girl or a holy one. But in the end, they agreed. Not because they were convinced, but because they could no longer ignore her. She was not loud. She was not violent. She was simply there, like a truth that had taken root and could not be pulled out. And so they gave her a horse. They gave her armor, ill-fitting and heavy, shaped for a man, not for her slender frame. They gave her an escort of soldiers who did not believe in her mission, but respected her courage. And when she mounted the horse, she did not look triumphant. She looked calm, as if she had been waiting for this moment, not for weeks, but for a lifetime. She did not ride with speed, but with purpose. The days were long. The roads were rough. Rain fell in sheets, turning paths to mud. Cold seeped into her bones, but she did not complain. She did not falter. She rode through forests where the trees loomed like silent watchers, through villages where people came to the windows to see the girl in armor, through rivers where the water rose to her horse's belly. And all the while, the voices remained soft, steady, constant like a thread, tying her to something greater than fear, greater than doubt, greater than the weight of what lay ahead. She did not know what awaited her at Jeanne, where the Dauphin waited in a castle surrounded by uncertainty. She did not know if he would listen, if he would believe, if he would send her away. But she knew she had to try, not for fame, not for power, not for revenge, but because a voice had spoken, and she had said yes. And in that yes, in that quiet, unbreakable decision, the world began to turn not with force, but with faith. Not with noise, but with the softest of movements, like a single hand reaching out in the dark, hoping to be met. We do not always know the meaning of our first steps. We only know that something inside us insists we take them. And in her journey, we are reminded that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward anyway. That faith is not the certainty of success, but the willingness to walk without knowing the way. That sometimes the most powerful acts are the quietest, the ones no one sees, the ones done in silence, the ones that begin not with a shout, but with a breath. She was still just a girl, but she was no longer only a girl. She was becoming a path, a vessel, a whisper of hope in a world that had forgotten how to listen. And as she rode toward the unknown, she carried not a sword, but a certainty, not a crown, but a calling. And though the road was long, though the night was dark, though the world did not yet know her name, she moved forward, because the first step had already been taken, and the rest would follow. The world did not shift all at once. It did not shatter with thunder, nor did the skies split open to mark her arrival. Change came softly, like the first light of dawn creeping across a field, like the slow turning of a leaf toward the sun, like a single note played so gently, it takes a moment to realize the song is already begun. She had not come with an army. She had not come with gold or titles or the approval of kings. She had come with a quiet certainty, a presence that could not be explained. And yet, as she drew closer to Jeanne, something in the air began to change. Not in the way of storms or battles, but in the way of whispers voices, lowering in conversation, eyes meeting with new attention, doors opening not because they had to, but because something deeper than reason had shifted. The world, heavy with war and doubt, began to lean toward her, not fully believing, not yet, but no longer able to look away, as if a single flame had been lit in a room full of shadows. And though it did not burn bright, it made everyone notice where the light was coming from. She rode through villages where the people stood in doorways, drawn not by spectacle, but by a quiet curiosity, as if they sensed they were witnessing something rare, not a warrior, not a noble, but a soul moving with a purpose too clear to ignore. Children followed her for a few steps before their mothers called them back. Old men paused in their work, their hands still on their hoes, their eyes following her path. A woman at a well said she had dreamed of a girl in armor the night before, though she could not explain why. No one shouted. No one knelt. But something passed between them, a recognition, not of fame, but of presence, as if they had all been waiting without knowing it, for someone to speak a truth so simple it cut through the noise of years. And she did not speak much. She only moved forward, her horse steady beneath her, her hands calm on the reins, her gaze fixed on the road ahead, as if she could already see the castle rising from the mist, the king waiting in shadow, the moment about to unfold, not as a performance, but as a quiet meeting between two souls, one burdened by power, the other carrying a calling. When she reached Jeanne, the fortress stood like a memory carved in stone, its towers rising from the hills, its walls scarred by time and weather. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and burning wood. Flags hung limp in the still air. Guards stood at the gate, their armor dull in the gray light, their expressions unreadable. She dismounted slowly, not with ceremony, but with care, as if every movement mattered, as if the weight of what she carried was not in her hands, but in her breath, in her stillness, in the way she held herself, not with pride, but with a quiet dignity that made even the most hardened soldier hesitate. She was not greeted with music or honor. She was not led through cheering crowds. She was taken to a room, small and dim, where she would wait again. But this time, the waiting was different. It was no longer the silence of disbelief, but the silence before a decision, the kind of stillness that gathers in a room when everyone knows something important is about to happen, even if they do not yet understand what it is, even if they fear it, even if they resist it. Inside the castle, the Dauphin sat surrounded by advisers, men in fine clothes who spoke in low voices, their faces lined with worry and suspicion. They had heard of her. They had heard the stories, the girl who claimed to hear voices, who had traveled alone, who had convinced a captain to send her here. Some called her a fraud. Some called her mad. Some whispered the word witch, not loudly, but with enough weight to make others hesitate. But one or two remained silent, watching, wondering if perhaps there was something more. The Dauphin himself said little. He was not a strong man. He was not a king, not yet. He was a prince burdened by doubt, by fear, by the weight of a crown he did not know how to wear. He had seen too many false prophets, too many who claimed divine favor only to fail. And yet, when they told him she had arrived, something in him paused. Not hope, not yet, but the faintest tremor of possibility, like a candle flame flickering in a draught, like a memory returning from a dream he could not quite recall. He did not believe in miracles, but he believed in desperation. And he was desperate. She waited for days, not in a chamber of luxury, but in a simple room with a bed, a chair, a small window that looked out over the courtyard. She did not pace. She did not complain. She prayed. She ate what was given. She spoke little. And slowly, the people around her began to notice. A servant said she thanked him for bread as if it were a gift from heaven. Guards said she looked at him not with fear, but with kindness, as if she saw not his armor, but his soul. A lady of the court, passing by, paused to watch her kneel in prayer, her hands folded, her face calm, and felt, for the first time in years, something like peace. These were not miracles. They were small things. But in a world that had forgotten how to be gentle, small things began to carry weight. They began to speak of her in quiet tones, not as a threat, not as a spectacle, but as someone different, someone whose silence felt deeper than words, whose presence felt older than her years. Then came the night when everything changed, not with a shout, but with a silence. She was brought before the court, not in a grand hall, but in a dimly lit chamber where the fire crackled low. The Dauphin was there, but he did not sit on the throne. He stood among his men, dressed like one of them, hidden in plain sight, wanting to test her, to see if she would be fooled. And when she entered, she did not scan the room with uncertainty. She did not hesitate. She walked forward, her eyes moving slowly across the faces, and then, without a word, without a gesture, she stopped before him. Not before the man who looked most important, not before the one with the finest clothes, but before the one whose eyes held the deepest doubt. And she knelt, not to a king, but to the one she had been sent to find. And in that moment, something broke open in the room. Not belief, not yet, but the first true crack in disbelief. How had she known? No one had told her. No sign had marked him. And yet she had found him, not by sight, but by something deeper and knowing that could not be taught, only given. The men looked at each other. The Dauphin's hands trembled, and for the first time in years, he felt not the weight of the crown, but the possibility of it. Still, they tested her. They questioned her for hours. They asked about her visions, about the saints, about the war. They sought contradictions, weaknesses, signs of deception. But she answered without fear, without anger, without pride. She spoke of Michael, of Margaret, of Catherine, not as distant figures, but as companions who had walked with her in the fields, who had guided her through the dark. She spoke of Orleans, of the suffering of the people, of the need to crown the king at Rheims. And when they asked why God would choose a girl, a peasant, she did not defend herself. She only said, "It is not by my strength, but by his will." And in that simplicity, in that humility, something in them began to shift. Not because she had proven anything, but because she carried a truth too pure to be fabricated, too deep to be performed. A theologian later said he had never seen such clarity in one so young. A soldier said her voice reminded him of his mother's prayers. And slowly, like water finding its level, the silence in the room turned from skepticism to something else, something closer to awe. She was taken to a room to rest. They whispered behind closed doors. Some still doubted, some feared deception. But others, the ones who had seen her pray, who had heard her speak, who had felt the stillness around her, began to wonder. What if this girl, this quiet soul, was not lying? What if she carried something real? What if, after years of war and betrayal, after so much blood and loss, help had come not in the form of an army, but in the form of a voice? Then slowly, like water finding its level, the decision formed. They would not send her to battle. Not yet. But they would not send her away. They would give her a chance. They would let her speak to the theologians in Poitiers, to be examined, to be tested. And if she passed, if no lie was found, then perhaps, just perhaps, they would listen. Not because they believed in miracles, but because they could not explain what they had just witnessed. And so the world began to move, not with force, not with conquest, but with the quiet turning of hearts. A servant began to pray again. A soldier remembered why he had first taken up his sword. A woman lit a candle in a forgotten chapel. And in the streets, people began to speak of the girl from Domrémy, not as a madwoman, but as someone who had looked at the king and known him without being told. The story spread not through proclamations, but through whispers, through glances, through the kind of quiet faith that grows in silence, like moss on stone, like roots beneath the soil. No one knew where it would lead. No one knew if she would succeed. But something had shifted. The air felt different. The light felt different. As if, after years of darkness, someone had opened a window. She did not know all of this. She only knew that she had been heard, that she had been seen, that the first great step had been taken. And as she lay that night on a narrow bed, listening to the wind outside the window, she did not feel triumph. She felt gratitude. And in the stillness, the voices returned, not with commands, but with comfort, like a hand resting on her shoulder, like a breath against her ear, reminding her that she was not alone, that she had not imagined it, that the path, though long, was real. She did not know what awaited her in Poitiers, what questions would be asked, what doubts would rise. But she knew she had not come this far to turn back. And so she closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to listen to the quiet rhythm of her breath, to the distant sound of the river, to the soft whisper of a world beginning to move. We do not always see how the world changes. We only know that sometimes a single presence, a single act of courage, a single moment of truth can shift the weight of history, not by force, but by faith. And in her quiet arrival, in her calm certainty, in her ability to see what others could not, we are reminded that the most powerful movements often begin not with armies, but with a single soul who dares to listen, to step forward, to say, I am here, not to conquer, not to rule, but to serve, to speak, to be present. She was still small. She was still young. She was still unknown to most of the world. But now, the world was beginning to know her, not as a legend, not as a saint, not as a soldier, but as a whisper that had grown just loud enough to be heard, not in the ears, but in the heart. And so the journey continued, not with fanfare, but with faith, not with certainty, but with trust. And as the days passed, as the tests began, as the theologians gathered to question her, she remained calm, still, unshaken like a flame that no wind could extinguish, like a river that knows, even in darkness, the way to the sea. The world had begun to move, and she, the girl from the fields, was no longer just walking through it. She was becoming part of its rhythm, part of its breath, part of the slow, quiet turning of a story that had not yet been written, but was already being lived. There was a silence that settled around her in the days that followed, not the silence of peace, but the silence of something unseen, unfolding beneath the surface of things, like the slow movement of roots beneath the soil, like the quiet gathering of clouds before a storm that may never come. She had been heard. She had been seen. She had stood before the Dauphin and known him without being told. And in that moment, something in the air had shifted. But shifts do not always bring acceptance. Sometimes they bring resistance, not loud, not violent, but deep, like a current beneath still water, pulling against what has been set in motion. And so she walked through the halls of the castle, not as a guest, not as a prisoner, but as a presence that could not be ignored, and yet was not fully welcomed. A girl who had spoken with such calm certainty that it unsettled those who had built their lives on doubt, on caution, on the careful weighing of power and consequence. She felt it in the way people looked away when she entered a room, not out of hatred, but out of discomfort, as if her stillness made their restlessness more visible. She felt it in the way conversations paused, not to honor her, but to measure her, to see if she would notice, to see if she would react. She felt it in the absence of invitations, in the lack of eye contact, in the way her name was spoken only in whispers, never in open counsel. And yet she did not falter. She did not grow hard. She did not retreat into pride or bitterness. She simply remained present, calm, unshaken, like a flame that burns not with fury, but with a steady light, one that does not demand attention, but cannot be unseen. She had not come to conquer hearts. She had come to fulfill a calling. And if hearts resisted, that was not her failure. It was their burden. There were nights when the weight of it pressed down, not on her body, but on her spirit, like a fog that seeped into the bones. She would kneel by the small window of her room, her hands folded, her breath slow, and she would pray not for victory, not for approval, but for the strength to remain herself, to not become what they feared her to be, a fanatic, a fraud, a threat, to not lose the gentleness that had carried her from Domrémy, the kindness that had made a guard pause, a servant smile, a king hesitate. She did not ask to be loved. She did not ask to be believed. She only asked to be true. And in those quiet hours, when the castle had settled into stillness, and the world outside slept beneath a sky full of stars, the voices returned, not with commands, not with urgency, but with a gentle presence, like a hand resting on her shoulder, like a breath against her ear, reminding her that she was not alone, that she had not imagined it, that the path, though long, was real. And slowly, the weight would lift, not because the world had changed, but because her heart had remembered why she had come. Some called her a witch, not to her face, but in the safety of private chambers, where words could be spoken without consequence, where fear could wear the mask of reason. They said no girl could know what she knew, could speak as she spoke, could move with such certainty, unless she had made a pact with forces beyond God. Others called her a fraud, a clever peasant girl who had learned to mimic holiness, to wear faith like a mask, to manipulate the weak-minded with visions and tears. And still others believed she was mad, that the voices she claimed to hear were not saints, but the fragments of a mind broken by war, by fear, by the unbearable weight of a world too dark to bear. And yet, none of them could explain how she had known the Dauphin. None of them could explain the stillness in her eyes, the peace in her voice, the way even the most hardened men felt something shift when she entered a room. And so the accusations remained whispers, not proclamations, because even those who doubted could not fully dismiss her, could not silence the quiet voice within that asked, "What if she is telling the truth?" She did not defend herself. She did not argue. She did not seek to convince. She simply was present, calm, unshaken. And in that stillness, she became something more than a girl, more than a messenger. She became a mirror. For those who believed, she reflected hope. For those who doubted, she reflected their own fear of being wrong. For those who resented her, she reflected the fragility of their power, the ease with which a single soul, unarmored and unarmed, could unsettle the foundations of a world built on titles and bloodlines. And for those who watched in silence, she reflected the possibility that truth could exist outside of education, outside of rank, outside of the systems that had always decided who was worthy of being heard. And so, the conflict was not really about her. It was about what she revealed in others, their insecurities, their loyalties, their hidden longings for something greater than politics, greater than war, greater than themselves. There were moments when she was tested, not by words, but by silence, invited to a council, only to be ignored, given a seat, but no voice, asked to wait, again and again, as if her time mattered less, and yet she did not protest. She waited. She listened. She observed. And when, at last, she was asked to speak, she did so not with anger, not with accusation, but with the same calm that had carried her through the fields, through the forests, through the long nights of prayer. She spoke of Orleans. She spoke of the people suffering under siege. She spoke of the need to act, not for glory, but for mercy, not for conquest, but for the simple act of lifting a burden from the shoulders of those who had carried it too long. And when she finished, there was no applause. There was only silence. But it was a different silence, one that did not reject, but considered. One that did not close, but opened, just slightly, like a door left ajar in the dark, letting in a sliver of light. The tension was not only outside her. It lived within too, though not in the way one might expect. She did not doubt the voices. She did not question the mission. But she questioned herself. Was she strong enough? Was she wise enough? Could a girl from a village truly lead an army? Could she bear the weight of lives, of choices, of consequences she could not yet see? These were not doubts of faith, but of humility. And in those moments, she did not seek answers in pride, but in prayer. She remembered the oak tree, the first whisper, the warmth in her chest. She remembered the long road to Chinon, the kindness of strangers, the way the wind had carried her forward when her body ached. And slowly, the inner conflict softened, not because it disappeared, but because it was held not by certainty, but by surrender, by the quiet knowing that she had not chosen this path, but had been chosen for it, and that was enough. She began to notice the small signs of change, not in declarations, but in gestures. A guard who nodded when she passed. A servant who left extra bread by her door. A lady of the court who knelt beside her in prayer, not out of duty, but out of something deeper, something that had no name but felt like peace. These were not victories. They were not proof of belief, but they were signs that the world was shifting, not all at once, but molecule by molecule, like frost melting in the morning light, like a single leaf turning toward the sun. And she did not take them as personal triumphs. She took them as gifts, reminders that even in the hardest hearts, kindness could still grow, if given time, if given space, if given the quiet courage to appear. There was one night when a young page, no older than she was, came to her door, his face pale, his hands trembling. He had heard the whispers, the accusations, the fear, and he asked her, in a voice barely above a whisper, if it was true, if she really heard voices. She did not answer at once. She looked at him, not with pity, not with superiority, but with recognition. She saw in him the same fear she had once carried, the same need to know if the unseen could be real. And she said, simply, "I do not know how to explain it, but I know it is true. And if you ever hear something deep, something kind, something that tells you who you are, do not be afraid to listen." He did not speak again. He only nodded and left. But the next day, he stood a little taller. And weeks later, she would learn he had begun to pray again, something he had not done since his mother died. The conflict was never resolved. It did not end with a speech, with a decree, with a moment of universal acceptance. It simply changed shape. The open doubt turned to quiet resistance. The resistance turned to hesitation. The hesitation turned, in some, to curiosity, in others to respect, and in a few to belief. Not because she had proven herself in battle, but because she had remained herself in the face of disbelief. Because she had not fought with anger, but with stillness. Because she had not demanded to be seen, but had simply stayed, like a flame that no wind could extinguish. And slowly, the world began to lean toward her, not because she had forced it, but because she had not broken. She did not seek allies, but they came. A chaplain who began to defend her in private. A captain who said her presence calmed the men. A woman in the village who said she had dreamed of a girl in armor leading a king to his crown. These were not powerful people. They were not nobles. But their quiet faith carried weight, because it was not loud, not performative, but deep, like roots growing beneath stone. And in their whispers, in their small acts of kindness, in their refusal to mock, something began to form, not an army, not a movement, but a current, a slow turning of the heart of the world. And so, the courage was not in her words, not in her visions, not in her mission. It was in her stillness, in her ability to stand in the middle of doubt and not become bitter, in her willingness to be misunderstood and still speak, in her choice to remain gentle, even when the world was hard. This was not the courage of the battlefield. This was the courage of the soul, the quiet, unbreakable decision to remain true, even when no one is watching, even when no one believes, even when the path ahead is dark and long. We do not always see this kind of courage. It does not make history books. It does not carry banners. But it changes the world, not with force, but with presence. And in her silent endurance, in her calm certainty, in her refusal to become what others feared, we are reminded that the deepest revolutions do not begin with swords, but with stillness. Not with noise, but with the quiet decision to remain kind, to remain faithful, to remain here, even when everything says to leave. She was still small. She was still young. She was still unknown to most of the world. But now, she was no longer just a girl with a message. She was becoming a presence, a quiet force, a light that did not blind, but revealed. And as the days passed As the tests in Poitiers approached, as the world continued to turn around her, she remained calm, still, unshaken, like a tree rooted in earth, bending in the wind, but never breaking. The conflicts did not disappear. They would never disappear, but they no longer defined her. She had walked through them, not with fury, but with faith, not with pride, but with humility. And in that walk, she had become something more than a messenger. She had become a testament to what one soul can carry, to what one heart can hold, to what one quiet yes can begin. And so the journey continued, not with fanfare, not with certainty, but with the quiet courage of a girl who had learned to listen, to wait, to stand while the world slowly began to hear. There came a night, not announced by stars or prophecy, not marked by thunder or fire, but carried in on a cold wind that moved through the camp like a breath from the earth itself, slow and deep, as if the world had paused to listen. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp soil and distant smoke, the kind of silence that gathers before something shifts, not with force, but with inevitability. Outside the walls of Orleans, the French army waited, not in readiness, but in resignation, their spirits worn thin by months of inaction, their faith worn down by defeat after defeat. The city within was starving, its people living in cellars, its children pale from hunger, its mothers whispering prayers into the dark. The English held the fortresses that ringed it, their flags hanging limp in the still air, their soldiers confident, certain that time was on their side. And so they waited. And while they waited, the city suffered, not loudly, not with cries, but with a quiet endurance that made the silence even heavier. She had arrived not with an army, not with weapons, not with the approval of the highest commanders, but with a presence that made men pause when she passed. She wore armor now, though it did not fit her as it fit the men. It was heavy, cold against her skin, shaped for broader shoulders, for a body that had spent years at war. But she wore it not for protection, but for purpose. It was not her strength they would follow, but her certainty. And yet, even now, even after all she had endured, even after the long journey, the doubts, the silent resistance, she was not given command. She was allowed to be there, to ride with the men, to carry her banner, but not to lead. The captains still spoke among themselves, still planned without her, still treated her words as suggestions, not as truth. And so she waited, not with impatience, not with anger, but with a quiet knowing that some things cannot be forced, that the right moment arrives not when we demand it, but when it is ready, when the world is leaned forward enough to hear. That night she knelt in her tent, the candlelight flickering against the canvas walls, casting long shadows that moved like silent watchers. The air was cold. Her breath formed small clouds in the dim light. She did not pray for victory. She did not ask for glory. She asked only to be used, to be a path through which something greater could move. She thought of the people inside Orleans, the children who had not tasted fresh bread in months, the mothers who whispered prayers over thin blankets, the old men who remembered peace as a distant dream. She thought of the soldiers outside, tired, afraid, their faith worn down by years of loss. And she felt, deep in her chest, the presence of the voices not loud, not urgent, but clear, like a bell ringing beneath water. Now, they said, not tomorrow, not when the sun rises. Now, and in that moment, she knew. Waiting was no longer obedience. It was fear, and fear had no place beside faith, not here, not tonight, not when a city was dying in silence. She rose slowly, her hands steady, her breath calm. She put on her armor, piece by piece, not with ceremony, but with care, as if dressing for a task that had been waiting for her since the beginning. She took her banner, not a weapon, but a symbol, white with images of Christ and angels, a sign of what she carried not in her hands, but in her heart. She did not wake anyone. She did not call for horses or trumpets. She did not announce her intention. She simply walked out of the tent, into the cold night, toward the gates of the city, toward the walls where the sentries stood, their breath visible in the dark. They saw her. They recognized her. And though they had orders to hold the gates closed, though they had been told no attack would come tonight, something in her presence made them hesitate. Not because she demanded it, but because she was, yet the embodiment of a truth too quiet to ignore, too deep to question. And so they did not stop her. They only watched, their hearts beating a little faster, as if sensing they were witnessing the first breath of a new story. And then, without a word, she began to climb. Not the main gate, not the fortified path, but a narrow, broken ladder that led up the outer wall. A route no soldier would take, too dangerous, too exposed. Her hands gripped the cold wood. Her boots slipped on the wet stone. The wind pulled at her cloak. Below, a few soldiers watched, frozen, not knowing whether to stop her or follow. And above, the English fortresses loomed, dark and silent, their guards unaware. She reached the top. She stood on the edge, her banner in one hand, her body small against the vast night sky. And then she raised it. Not high, not with force, but with intention. A quiet act, a simple gesture. But in that moment, something broke open in the air, like the first crack in ice before the river flows, like a single note that begins a song too long forgotten. Below, a soldier whispered her name. Another took a step forward, then another, then another. Not because they had been ordered, but because they had been awakened. They saw her, small and alone on the wall, facing the enemy, not with a sword, but with a flag, with a faith so deep it defied reason. And slowly they began to move, not in silence, but in a murmur, like the sound of water beginning to flow. They climbed the ladders. They took their weapons. They followed not because they believed victory was possible, but because they could not stay behind. To see her standing there, so unafraid, so certain, was to remember something they had forgotten, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward anyway, that faith is not the certainty of success, but the willingness to act when no one else will. The attack did not come with horns or drums. It came quietly, like dawn creeping over the hills. The French moved through the darkness, not with fury, but with purpose, guided by the sight of her banner, still raised, still steady, still glowing in the faint light. They took the first fortress by surprise. The English, caught off guard, fought, but not with the strength of those who expect to win. And when the sun rose, the city of Orleans was no longer surrounded. One of the great bastions of the siege had fallen, not by strategy, not by numbers, but by a single act of faith, carried out in silence, in darkness, in the middle of the night. And though the victory was small in scale, it was vast in meaning, like a single spark that sets a forest alight, not because it is bright, but because the world was ready to burn. She was wounded that night. A crossbow bolt struck her in the shoulder, just above the armor. She fell to her knees, her breath sharp, her vision blurring. The men around her froze, not knowing what to do. But she did not cry out. She did not collapse. She pulled the bolt out herself, her hand steady, her face calm, and then she rose again, still holding her banner, still moving forward. And when the men saw her blood on the stone, saw her rise, saw her continue, they did not see a girl. They saw something else, something beyond flesh, something that could not be broken. And in that moment, their fear turned to something else. Not blind loyalty, not fanaticism, but a quiet, unshakable belief that perhaps, just perhaps, she was not just a messenger. Perhaps she was a sign, a presence sent not to command, but to awaken. The city gates opened. The people came out, not in celebration, not yet, but in disbelief, in wonder, in tears. They touched the hem of her cloak as she passed. They whispered prayers. They lit candles in the streets. And inside the cathedral, a priest began to ring the bell, not for mass, not for mourning, but for the first time in months, for hope. The commanders who had doubted her stood in silence. They did not speak. They did not congratulate her. But they looked at her differently, not as a curiosity, not as a problem, but as someone who had done what they could not, had stepped into the dark and said, "I am here." And in that look, something shifted, not in rank, not in power, but in the quiet recognition that true leadership does not come from titles, but from the willingness to go first. She did not claim victory. She did not demand praise. She went to the cathedral and knelt before the altar, her hands folded, her head bowed, her body trembling now that the fight was over. And there, in the quiet, the voices returned, not with triumph, not with pride, but with peace. "You have done what was asked." And in that moment, she wept, not for glory, not for recognition, but because she had not failed, because the light had reached a place that had been in darkness for too long, because the city could breathe again, because the children would eat, because for the first time in months, someone had chosen to act when it would have been easier to wait. The world did not change all at once. The war was not over. The English were not gone, but something had shifted, not in maps, not in treaties, but in hearts. A soldier who had once mocked her now carried a piece of her banner in his pocket. A captain who had refused to listen now asked for her counsel. A child in the city drew her face in the dirt with a stick, not as a warrior, but as a protector. And in the villages beyond, people began to speak of the girl who had walked into the night and brought the dawn with her, not because she had magic, not because she had an army, but because she had listened. And when the time came, she had moved. We do not always recognize turning points when they happen. They do not come with fanfare. They come in silence, in small acts, in decisions made when no one is watching. And in her quiet climb, in her steady hand, in her refusal to wait any longer, we are reminded that the most powerful moments in history are not the ones that shake the earth, but the ones that stir the soul. That change does not always begin with armies. Sometimes it begins with a single person, standing in the dark, holding a banner that no one asked for, but that the world suddenly cannot live without. She was still small. She was still young. She was still not understood by many. But now she was no longer just a presence. She was becoming a force not of war, but of will, not of conquest, but of conviction. And though the path ahead would grow darker, though betrayal would come, though fire would one day wait for her, she had already done what she had been sent to do. She had broken the siege, not just of a city, but of doubt. And so the night faded, the stars dimmed, the wind stilled. And in the quiet aftermath, as the city breathed again, as the soldiers rested, as the candles burned low, she remained kneeling, exhausted, wounded, but at peace, like a flame that had burned through the dark, not to be seen, but to show the way. The turning point had passed. It had not been loud. It had not been long, but it had been real. And in its wake, the world began to move again, not because of a decree, not because of a king, but because one soul had dared to rise in the shadows and say, without words, now. There came a time, not marked by battle or decree, but by a quiet shift in the air, when the world around her began to feel different, not because the war had ended, but because she had changed within, not in belief, not in purpose, but in the way she carried herself through the days, as if the weight of what she had done had settled into her bones, like dust after a long journey, invisible but present. The victory at Orleans had been real. The city had been freed. The people had wept with relief, their hands reaching for bread, for water, for the sunlight they had not felt in months. The soldiers had followed her with new eyes, not just with respect, but with something deeper, a kind of awe, as if they had witnessed not a military triumph, but a miracle too quiet to name. But triumph, when it arrives after long darkness, does not always bring peace. Sometimes it brings clarity. And clarity, in a world built on power and silence, can be a kind of loneliness, not of the body, but of the soul. She walked through the camps now with a presence that was no longer just her own, but something shared, something carried by others, by the way soldiers stepped aside when she passed, by the way mothers pointed her out to their children, by the way even the wind seemed to pause when she knelt to pray. She did not ask for this reverence. She did not seek it, and yet it followed her like a shadow, growing longer with each step forward. The men still called her La Pucelle, the Maiden, as if she were not of this world, as if her feet did not touch the same earth as theirs. But she felt no pride in the title. She only felt its weight, like a crown made of airlight to see, heavy to wear. It was not the armor that tired her. It was the distance it created, the way people looked at her not as a companion, but as a symbol, a question they could not answer, a truth they could not hold. She did not stay in the cities. She did not rest. She asked to continue to march to Reims, to crown the Dauphin, to fulfill what had been shown to her in the quiet between breaths. But the court hesitated. The war was not over. The English still held much of the north, and so they delayed. They spoke of strategy, of supply lines, of politics. And slowly, the momentum she had carried began to slow, not because the enemy was stronger, but because the Allies were afraid not of battle, but of what she represented. A girl who spoke with certainty, peasant who moved with purpose, a woman who did not bow to the rules of men. And so, while she waited, while she prayed, while she walked the edges of the camp at dawn, the world began to shift around her, not in open opposition, but in quiet withdrawal, like water slowly receding from the shore, leaving behind only the damp imprint of what had once been there. There were nights when she sat alone, not in her tent, but beneath the open sky, her back against a tree, her hands resting on her knees, her breath slow and deep. The stars were sharp above her, cold and distant, but she did not feel small beneath them. She felt held. And in that stillness, she began to understand something she had not seen before, that victory is not always in the taking of a fortress, but in the quiet moments after, when the heart asks, "What have I lost?" She had not lost her faith. She had not lost her purpose. But she had lost something softer, something more fragile, the simplicity of being just a girl who listened. Now she was a symbol, a tool, a question that no one wanted to answer. And though the people loved her, they did not know her. They saw the armor, the banner, the calm gaze, but they did not see the loneliness, the weariness, the way her hands trembled sometimes when no one was looking, the way her breath caught when a distant bell reminded her of home. She thought of Domrémy often, not with longing, not with regret, but with a quiet tenderness, like remembering a dream that was real while it lasted. She remembered the smell of bread in the morning, the sound of her mother's voice, the way the cows moved slowly through the grass at dusk. She remembered the oak tree, the first whisper, the warmth in her chest. And she wondered if that girl could have imagined this, the weight of a nation on her shoulders, the silence of those who once doubted, the way even kindness now felt like a burden. She did not wish to go back. She did not regret the path. But she mourned the innocence, the ease, the time when the voices were a secret, not a spectacle, when her faith was a private thing, not a public test. She was wounded, not only in the shoulder from the crossbow bolt, but in ways no one could see. There were moments when she would pause in the middle of speaking, her breath catching, her vision blurring, as if the body could no longer carry the weight of the soul. The healers said she needed rest. The priests said she needed prayer. The commanders said she needed to be careful, but no one said, "You are allowed to be tired." No one said, "You are allowed to weep." And so she did not in front of them. But in the quiet hours, when the camp had settled into stillness, she would press her forehead against the cold stone of a chapel wall and let the tears fall, not for herself, but for the cost of being seen, for the loneliness of being chosen, for the way the world now looked at her not as a person, but as a sign, as if her humanity had become secondary to her mission. And yet, in that sorrow, there was light. Not the bright light of victory, but the soft glow of understanding. She began to see that the mission was not only about crowns and cities, but about what happens in the heart when someone dares to step forward. She saw it in the young soldier who now prayed before battle, in the captain who had begun to treat his men with kindness, in the women of the villages who looked at her not with pity, but with hope, as if her presence proved that even the smallest voice could be heard by God. These were not victories written in books. They were quiet revolutions, invisible to history, but real to those who lived them. And in them she found a different kind of strength, not the strength to fight, but the strength to endure, to remain gentle, to keep listening, even when the world tried to turn her into a weapon. She did not speak of these things. She did not preach. She only lived them. And slowly, the people began to see not just the warrior, not just the messenger, but the human being beneath, the one who knelt in prayer longer than necessary, who shared her bread with a beggar, who looked at the stars with something like peace. And in that seeing, something shifted, not in strategy, not in politics, but in the soul of the army, in the quiet belief that perhaps they were not just fighting for a king, but for something deeper, something older than war, something that had no name but felt like dignity, like memory, like the return of a forgotten truth. There was a morning when a little girl, no older than 8, came to the edge of the camp, her dress torn, her face thin from hunger. She did not speak. She only held out a small wildflower picked from the field. And when Juana knelt to receive it, the child whispered, "My mother says you saved us." Juana did not say she had done it alone. She did not say it was God's will. She only took the flower, pressed it gently between her hands, and said, "Then we saved each other." And in that moment, she understood. The victory was not in the taking of a fortress, but in the giving of a flower, in the receiving of a truth too simple to be ignored, in the quiet exchange of one human heart to another, without armor, without banners, without words. She began to write, not orders, not proclamations, but letters soft, quiet words sent to the dauphin, to the priests, to the commanders, not with anger, not with demand, but with care. She asked for mercy. She asked for unity. She asked for the coronation to happen, not for glory, but because it was the next step, the one that had been shown to her. And though many of the letters were ignored, some were read, some were remembered, and in a few hearts a seed was planted not of blind loyalty, but of quiet respect, of the idea that perhaps this girl, this peasant, this woman, carried something real, something beyond ambition, something that could not be bought or taken. The losses were real. She had lost the ease of her youth. She had lost the safety of being unknown. She had lost the comfort of being believed without question. But in their place, she had gained something deeper, the knowledge that she was not alone, that the voices had not left, that the path, though dark, was still hers to walk. And in that knowing, there was a peace that no battle could give, no crown could bestow, no army could protect. It was not the peace of victory, but the peace of surrender, not to defeat, but to purpose, to the quiet certainty that she had not been wrong, that she had not imagined it, that even in silence, even in loneliness, she was still being guided. She did not become bitter. She did not grow hard. She did not stop praying. She did not stop speaking. But she learned to carry the weight without letting it break her. She learned that courage is not only in the charge, but in the pause. Not only in the shout, but in the breath before the next step. And in that learning, she became not just a leader, but a presence. A quiet force that moved not with force, but with faith, not with power, but with patience, not with certainty, but with trust in what could not be seen. We do not always see the cost of being true. It is not in the wounds we show, but in the ones we hide. Not in the battles we win, but in the nights we survive. And in her quiet endurance, in her gentle strength, in her refusal to become what the world expected, we are reminded that the deepest transformations are not in the world, but in the soul. That the most powerful acts are not the ones that shake the earth, but the ones that soften the heart. She was still small. She was still young. She was still not understood by many. But now, she was no longer just a girl with a banner. She was becoming a light, not bright, not blinding, but steady, like a candle in a window, showing the way home, not for armies, but for those who had forgotten how to hope. And so the journey continued, not with certainty, not with ease, but with the quiet courage of one who had learned to carry loss, to honor lessons, and to walk forward, even when the light ahead was faint, even when the road was long, even when the world no longer knew how to see her clearly. There were moments when she looked at her hands, still the same hands that had milked cows, that had gathered herbs, that had folded in prayer beneath the oak tree, and wondered how they had come to hold a banner, how they had come to lead an army, how they had come to be seen as holy when they still carried the dirt of the earth. And in that wonder, she found peace, not because she had become something greater, but because she had remained something real. She did not need to be remembered. She did not need to be praised. She only needed to be faithful. And in that faithfulness, in that quiet, unbroken thread between who she had been and who she had become, she carried not only her mission, but the quiet proof that a single soul, when it listens deeply, can change the rhythm of the world. The world had not changed completely, but it had changed enough. And in the stillness after victory, as the wind moved through the fields, as the stars watched in silence, she remained kneeling, breathing, listening like a heart that had learned to beat not for glory, but for grace. There came a time, not marked by proclamations or monuments, but by a quiet shift in the way people spoke, in the way they moved, in the way they looked at one another, as if something in the air had changed, not all at once, but like the slow turning of a leaf toward the sun. She was still there, still walking through the camps, still wearing the same armor, still carrying her banner, but the world around her had begun to carry her story without her speaking it. It lived in the soldier who now prayed before battle, not out of duty, but from a quiet belief that someone was listening. It lived in the woman who lit a candle in a forgotten chapel and whispered her name, not as a saint, but as a reminder that even the smallest voice could be heard by God. And it lived in the children who began to draw her face in the dirt with sticks, not as a warrior, but as a protector, as if her presence had already become a kind of shelter, a soft place in a world too hard to bear. She did not notice it at first. She was not looking for proof. She was not seeking signs. She only continued forward, asking to march to Reims, to crown the Dauphin, to fulfill what had been shown to her in the quiet between breaths. But slowly she began to feel it, not in words, not in praise, but in the way people looked at her differently, not with awe alone, but with something softer, something closer to trust. A young page who had once mocked her now brought her bread without being asked. A captain who had refused to listen now stood beside her in silence, as if learning how to be still. And in the villages they passed, mothers would kneel as she walked by, not in worship, but in gratitude, as if they saw in her not just a girl, but the possibility that a woman could be strong without becoming hard, could be certain without being cruel, could be chosen without forgetting where she came from. And then, one morning, she received a letter not from a king, not from a commander, but from a woman in a distant village, written in shaky hand, the paper worn from travel. The woman wrote that her son had been lost in battle, that she had not prayed in years, that she had given up on God. But then she heard the story of the girl who had raised her banner in the dark, who had climbed the wall alone, who had led an army not with a sword, but with a flag. And something in her broke open. She said she lit a candle that night, the first in 10 years, and wept. She did not know if God had heard her, but she said she felt, for the first time, that she had been heard. Juana read the letter in silence, her hands steady, her breath slow. She did not show it to anyone. She only folded it carefully and placed it beside her bed. And that night she prayed longer than usual, not for victory, not for strength, but for the woman, for her son, for all the silent hearts who had begun to hope again because of something she had not meant to give. She did not claim to be a miracle. She did not say she had healed anyone, but she began to understand that her life was no longer only her own. It had become a vessel, a path through which something older, something deeper was moving, not through force, not through conquest, but through presence, through the quiet certainty of a girl who had listened when no one else would, who had stepped forward when it would have been easier to wait, who had remained gentle even when the world tried to make her hard. And in that presence, others began to remember parts of themselves they had forgotten, the part that still believed, still hoped, still dared to think that one soul could make a difference, even in a world so heavy with war. There were moments when she saw it in the smallest gestures. A soldier who shared his last piece of bread, a priest who blessed the men before battle, not with fear, but with peace, a child who handed her a wildflower, just as another had done before. And each time she received it not as a tribute, but as a gift, a sign that the light she carried was not hers alone, but was being passed on, not in speeches, not in laws, but in the quiet exchange of one human heart to another. She did not need to be remembered. She did not need to be praised. But she could not deny that something was growing not around her, but within the world, like roots spreading beneath the soil, unseen but unshakable. She began to notice how the voices spoke differently now, not with urgency, not with commands, but with a kind of peace, as if the most important part of the journey was no longer ahead, but behind. They did not say, "Go further." They said, "You are seen." Not as a warrior, not as a leader, but as a soul who had remained faithful. And in that recognition, she felt a deep, quiet relief, like the release of breath after holding it too long. She had not come to change the world overnight. She had come to plant a seed. And now she could see that it had taken root, not in palaces, not in armies, but in the hearts of those who had once believed nothing could change. There was a morning when she stood at the edge of a field, watching the sun rise over the hills, the light spilling slowly across the grass, turning the dew into gold. A young girl, no older than she had been when the voices first came, stood beside her, silent, her hands folded. After a long while, the girl whispered, "Do you ever miss being small?" Juana did not answer at once. She looked at the horizon, at the light, at the stillness. Then she said, "I don't miss being small, but I remember how it felt to be seen only by God." And the girl nodded, as if she understood. And in that moment, Juana knew. The legacy was not in the battles won, not in the cities freed, but in the quiet knowing that a girl could still listen, could still step forward, could still carry a truth too soft for the world to hear, but too real to ignore. She did not become a teacher. She did not gather disciples. But people began to follow not her commands, but her example, her prayer, her kindness, her refusal to hate. A soldier who had once beaten a prisoner now refused to strike a man who had surrendered. A noble who had mocked her faith now asked for a priest to visit his tent. And in the villages, people began to speak of her not as a legend, but as a memory, as if she had already become part of the land, like the river, like the wind, like the old oak tree beneath which she had first heard the voices. And though she was still alive, still walking, still breathing, her story had already begun to live without her, like a song that continues after the singer has left the room. She did not know how far it reached. She did not know that in a distant town, a woman had named her daughter Jeanne for the first time in generations. She did not know that a blind man in a chapel had begun to pray with new words. Let me see as she saw, not with eyes, but with heart. She did not know that a young scribe had copied her letters into a book, not because he was ordered to, but because he felt they carried a light too rare to lose. And she did not need to know, because the legacy was not in being remembered. It was in being felt in the quiet decisions of others to be kinder, to be braver, to be more faithful, not because they had seen a miracle, but because they had seen a human being who had chosen to listen. There were still those who doubted. There were still those who feared her, who resented her, who whispered that she carried a power too dangerous to trust. But even they could not deny that something had changed. The army moved differently. The people spoke differently. The air itself felt different, as if the world had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. And though the war was not over, though the English still held the north, though the path to Reims was long and uncertain, the momentum had shifted, not because of strategy, but because of faith, not because of power, but because of presence. She did not claim it. She did not take credit. She only continued forward, her banner in hand, her heart steady, her steps calm. And in that simplicity, the legacy grew not in stone, not in gold, but in the quiet belief that one soul, when it listens deeply, can change the rhythm of the world. We do not always see how a life becomes a light. It does not happen in a single act. It happens in the small choices, in the quiet courage, in the way a hand is offered, a prayer is whispered, a banner is raised in the dark. And in her gentle strength, in her unbroken faith, in her refusal to become what the world expected, we are reminded that the deepest legacies are not built with swords, but with stillness, not with noise, but with the softest of movements, like a single hand reaching out in the dark, hoping to be met. She was still small in stature, still young in years, still wrapped in the quiet simplicity of one who had never sought greatness, never reached for power, never asked to be remembered. Her hands were not calloused from rule, but from prayer, from holding a banner in the wind, from tending to the wounded, from folding bread into the palms of strangers. She was still not understood by many, not by the kings who used her name, not by the commanders who followed her only when they had no other choice, not by the world that could not reconcile a girl with a mission that defied reason. And yet, in that very not knowing, in that space where logic failed and fear hesitated, something profound had begun to unfold. She was no longer just a girl with a mission, no longer merely a messenger sent from the quiet fields of Domrémy. She was becoming something far more enduring, a presence not defined by action, but by essence a quiet force that moved not with force, but with faith, not with noise, but with the gentle persistence of a truth too deep to be silenced. She carried herself now not as a warrior, not as a leader, but as a vessel hollow enough to be filled, open enough to be guided, steady enough to be trusted. And in that openness, the world began to see not what she had done, but what she was, a soul who had listened when others had closed their ears, who had stepped forward when it would have been easier to stay hidden, who had remained gentle in a world that rewarded hardness, who had spoken with clarity in a time of confusion. She did not claim to be holy. She did not demand belief. She only lived her truth, quietly, consistently, without fanfare, and in that living, she became a mirror for the hopeful, a reflection of courage. For the broken, a sign that healing was possible. For the lost, a reminder that even in the darkest night, A single voice could be enough to guide the way. And so, the journey continued not with fanfare, not with parades or proclamations, not with the blare of trumpets or the weight of expectation, but with the quiet knowledge that what she had done was already becoming something greater than herself. It was no longer just about the march to Reims, no longer only about the coronation of a king, no longer confined to the battles fought on muddy fields. It was about the way a soldier now paused before striking a man who had surrendered. It was about the way a child whispered her name before sleep, as if it were a prayer. It was about the way a woman in a distant village lit a candle and said, "If she could believe, maybe I can too." It was about the letters copied by scribes who did not know why they saved them, only that they felt important. It was about the silence that followed her, not of fear, but of reverence, the kind that gathers in a room when someone enters who carries a light, not for themselves, but for everyone. The legacy had begun not with a shout, not with a crown placed upon a head, not with the thunder of cannons or the signing of treaties. It began in stillness, in the space between one breath and the next. In the moment, a girl knelt beneath an oak tree and said yes to a voice no one else could hear. It began in the dark, when she climbed a broken ladder alone, her hands cold, her heart steady, her banner raised not in defiance, but in offering. It began in the quiet aftermath of battle, when she pulled the bolt from her shoulder and rose again, not because she was unbreakable, but because she had promised to keep going. And it began in the hearts of those who, having seen her, could no longer pretend that courage had to be loud, that faith had to be proven, that a girl could not change the world simply by being true. It was not a legacy of monuments, though they would come, not of statues, though they would rise. It was a legacy of the unseen, the way a mother now told her daughter, "You can listen to what you feel." The way a prisoner in a distant land, centuries later, would whisper her name in the dark, not as a plea, but as a companion. The way a teacher would one day read her story to a classroom of quiet children, and see one of them look up, eyes wide, as if seeing for the first time that one person can matter. It was the legacy of a whisper that had grown just loud enough to be carried by the wind, not to conquer, but to comfort, not to command, but to call gently. You are not alone. You are seen. You are needed. And though she did not know it, yet though she still walked with her eyes on the road ahead, still prayed for guidance, still carried the weight of a world that did not fully understand her, the world would never forget her. Not because of the cities she helped to save, not because of the king she led to his crown, not because of the armor she wore, or the battles she inspired, but because of who she had been, a girl from a village, with no title, no wealth, no education, who believed in something invisible and followed it anyway, who remained kind when scorned, faithful when doubted, gentle when hardened, who did not become what the world expected, but stayed exactly who she was, soft, strong, certain, small. And in that staying, in that quiet, unbroken thread between her heart and what she believed, she became eternal. Not because she was perfect, but because she was real. Not because she won, but because she listened. And in a world that so often forgets how to hear, that was enough. Time did not stop after she was gone. It did not freeze in sorrow, nor did it rush forward in triumph. It simply continued, as it always had, slow and steady, like a river carrying leaves downstream, not with force, but with inevitability. The war went on. Kings still claimed thrones. Soldiers still marched. The world turned, not because of her, but with her memory now woven into its rhythm, like a thread of gold stitched into cloth too worn to shine on its own. She was no longer there to speak, no longer there to raise her banner, no longer there to walk through the camps with quiet certainty. But something of her remained, not in stone, not in law, not in the names of battles, but in the way people began to remember what it meant to believe in something unseen. to act without knowing the outcome, to remain gentle in a world that so often rewards hardness, to carry a truth that no one else could see, and still walk forward anyway. Years passed, then decades, then centuries, and still her name did not fade, not because it was shouted in victory, but because it was whispered in moments of quiet courage. A young girl, centuries later, reading her story by candlelight, would close the book and sit in silence, not with awe, but with recognition, as if something deep inside her had stirred, as if a door long closed had creaked open, just enough to let in a sliver of light. A soldier, wounded and alone on a battlefield far from home, would murmur her name not as a prayer for survival, but as a companion, as if her presence could still walk beside him in the dark. A woman, standing at the edge of a decision too great to face alone, would think of the girl who had climbed a broken ladder with a banner in hand and say, softly, if she could go, so can I. And in these quiet moments, across time and space, her life continued, not as history, but as breath, not as legend, but as a quiet force that moved through the heart of those who have learned how to listen. The world began to gather around her memory, not with fanfare, but with reverence, like moss growing on stone, like roots spreading beneath soil, unseen but unshakable. Statues were built, yes, in squares and cathedrals, of her on horseback, in armor, with a flag raised high. But the true memorial was not in stone. It was in the way a mother now told her daughter, "You don't have to be loud to be strong." It was in the way a prisoner in a cold cell would close his eyes and remember the girl who had refused to hate, even when hatred was all that was given to her. It was in the way a priest, centuries later, would light a candle not for a saint, but for a soul who had listened when no one else would. These were not acts of worship. They were acts of recognition of a truth too rare to forget, of a life that had not sought to be remembered, but had become unforgettable anyway, not because of what she had done, but because of who she had been. She was not always remembered clearly. Time blurred the details. Some stories grew larger than life. Some called her a warrior. Some called her a martyr. Some turned her into a symbol of war, forgetting that her deepest strength had been in peace. But even in the distortions, even in the myths, something real remained, the echo of a voice that had said, "I was sent, not for glory, not for power, but for mercy." And slowly, the world began to remember not just what she did, but who she had been, a girl from a village with no title, no army, no education, who had believed in something invisible and followed it anyway, who had not asked to be chosen, but had said yes anyway, who had not sought to change the world, but had changed it anyway, simply by being true to what she felt, even when the world called her mad. The places she had walked became quiet without her. The fields of Orleans grew green again. The stones of Rouen stood in silence. The oak tree in Domrémy still stood, its roots deep in the earth, its branches reaching toward the sky as if still listening. Pilgrims came, not in crowds, but one by one, drawn not by spectacle, but by stillness. They would stand beneath the tree, close their eyes, and wait, not for visions, not for voices, but for the faintest sense of presence, as if the air itself remembered what had happened there. And sometimes, in the hush between breaths, they would feel it, not a sound, not a sight, but a warmth in the chest, a softness in the mind, a knowing that they were not alone, that something of her still lingered, not as a ghost, but as a quiet force, like the wind that moves through leaves without breaking them, like a prayer that has no words, but still reaches the sky. The Church, years later, would declare her a saint, not because she had performed miracles, but because she had lived one, the miracle of staying true in a world that tried to break her. But even that title felt too heavy for who she had been. She had not sought holiness. She had sought obedience. She had not wanted to be worshipped. She had only wanted to serve. And so, while some knelt before her image in cathedrals, others remembered her in simpler ways. A woman lighting a candle in a small chapel, a child drawing her face in the dirt, a soldier folding a letter with her words written inside. These were not acts of religion. They were acts of remembrance, of a soul who had carried light not to blind, but to guide, not to conquer, but to comfort, not to command, but to call gently into the dark. Time did not erase her. It softened her. It turned her edges into whispers, her actions into reflections, her life into a question that would never stop being asked. What would you do if you heard a voice no one else could hear? Not a voice of anger, not a voice of fear, but a voice of quiet certainty, asking only for courage, for faith, for the willingness to step forward even when the path is dark. And in that question, across centuries, people began to find pieces of themselves, not because they believed in visions, but because they believed in listening, in trusting what they felt even when the world said it was impossible, in the idea that truth does not always come with proof, but with presence, with a knowing that cannot be taught, only lived. She was not the only one. She would not be the last. And slowly, the world began to see her not as an exception, but as a reminder that courage does not always wear armor, that faith does not always speak in sermons, that change does not always come with thunder, but often with silence. A teacher would one day read her story to a classroom of quiet children, and see one of them look up, eyes wide, as if seeing for the first time that one person can matter. A writer would dream of her in the hours before dawn, not as a legend, but as a companion. A mother would whisper her name to her daughter at bedtime, not as a warning, but as a blessing. You can be soft and strong. You can be small and brave. You can listen and still be believed. The world changed not because of her alone, but because of what she made possible in others. Not because she won a war, but because she proved that a single soul, when it listens deeply, can shift the weight of history, not by force, but by presence. And as centuries passed, as empires rose and fell, as new wars began and ended, her story did not grow old. It grew deeper, like a well with no bottom, like a song that changes with every voice that sings it, yet remains the same at its core. It was not a story of conquest. It was a story of listening, not of power, but of surrender, not of victory, but of faithfulness. And in that faithfulness, something eternal took root. There were moments when her name was forgotten by the world, buried under politics, under fear, under the noise of progress. But then, in a quiet corner, a library, a chapel, a child's bedroom, someone would open a book, light a candle, close their eyes, and remember. And in that remembering, she returned not in body, not in time, but in spirit, like a breath returning to a room long still. And the world, without knowing it, leaned toward her again, just slightly, like a flower turning toward the sun, as if the memory of her was not just a story, but a force, a quiet gravity that pulls the heart toward what is true. We do not always know how a life becomes eternal. It does not happen in the moment of death. It happens in the quiet after, in the way a story is told, in the way a name is spoken, in the way a heart remembers what it felt when it first heard her voice. And in her gentle strength, in her unbroken faith, in her refusal to become what the world expected, we are reminded that the deepest legacies are not built with swords, but with stillness, not with noise, but with the softest of movements, like a single hand reaching out in the dark, hoping to be met. She was still small. She was still young. She was still not understood by many. But now, she was no longer just a girl with a mission. She was becoming a presence, a quiet force, a whisper that had grown just loud enough to be carried by the wind, not to conquer, but to comfort, not to command, but to call gently, "You are not alone. You are seen. You are needed." And though she did not know it, yet though she still walked with her eyes on the road ahead, still prayed for guidance, still carried the weight of a world that did not fully understand her, the world would never forget her. Not because of the cities she helped to save, not because of the king she led to his crown, not because of the armor she wore or the battles she inspired, but because of who she had been, a girl from a village with no title, no wealth, no education, who believed in something invisible and followed it anyway, who remained kind when scorned, faithful when doubted, gentle when hardened, who did not become what the world expected, but stayed exactly who she was, soft, strong, certain, small. And in that staying, in that quiet, unbroken thread between her heart and what she believed, she became eternal. Not because she was perfect, but because she was real. Not because she won, but because she listened. And in a world that so often forgets how to hear, that was enough. Time gathered around her memory, not to bury it, but to cradle it, like a river shaping a stone, not to destroy, but to smooth, to carry it forward, not in triumph, but in tenderness. And as the centuries passed, as the world changed, as new voices rose and fell, hers did not disappear. It simply became part of the silence, part of the breath, part of the quiet courage that still lives in those who dare to believe in what they cannot see. And so, the story did not end. It only changed shape. It moved from action to memory, from history to heart, from the past to the present, carried not in books, but in breath, in prayer, in the soft decision of one soul to listen, just as she had. There is a moment, just before sleep takes you, when the world softens, when the edges of thought blur, when the mind lets go of the day and begins to drift, not toward dreams, but toward something older, something deeper, a place where time does not move in lines, but in circles, where the past is not gone, but gathered close, like breath in a quiet room. And in that moment, if you listen, you might feel it not a sound, not a voice, but a presence, like the warmth of sunlight on skin, like the memory of a hand that once held yours when you were small. It is not loud. It does not demand attention, but it is there. And sometimes in the stillness, you realize you have heard it before, not in this life, not in this time, but in the quiet corners of your heart, where truths too soft to name have always lived, where a whisper has waited, not to command, but to comfort, not to rush, but to remind you that you are not alone. She is not gone, not really. She does not walk through fields in armor, not anymore. But she walks in other ways, in the girl who closes her eyes and says, "I believe even if no one else does," in the woman who speaks up when silence would be safer, in the child who kneels to help someone without thinking, in the soldier who refuses to hate, in the prisoner who prays without expecting an answer, in the dreamer who listens to something no one else can hear. These are not acts of imitation. They are echoes, soft, distant, but real, like the ripple that continues long after the stone has sunk. And though her name may not be spoken, though her story may not be known, something of her lives on, not in history books, but in the quiet courage of those who choose to be gentle when the world rewards hardness, to be faithful when no one is watching, to follow a path that makes no sense to anyone but themselves, who carry a truth too fragile for noise, too real for proof, too deep to be silenced. There is a church in a small village in France where, every year on the same night, an old woman lights a candle and places it by the window. She does not know why she started. She only knows that it feels right, as if she is honoring someone she has never met. In a city far away, a student sits alone in a library, reading a book about a girl who changed a kingdom, not with an army, but with a banner and a voice no one else could hear. He closes the book slowly, not with excitement, but with a quiet fullness in his chest, as if something has shifted, not in the world, but within him. And in a bedroom somewhere, a child whispers her name before sleep, not because she was told to, but because it feels like a prayer, like a promise that even in darkness, someone is listening, These are not miracles. They are not grand events, but they are real. And in their quiet, they carry the same truth she carried, that one soul, when it listens deeply, can change the rhythm of the world, not by force, not by noise, but by presence. You may not hear it in words. You may not see it in visions. But you might feel it in the stillness between breaths, in the moment before you speak, in the choice to be kind when it would be easier to turn away. You might feel it when you sit with someone who is suffering, not to fix, but to be there. When you speak a truth that no one wants to hear. When you protect something fragile, not because it is useful, but because it is true. These are not acts of heroism. They are acts of listening. And in them, she lives not as a statue, not as a saint, not as a warrior, but as a whisper in the wind, still calling, still guiding, still saying, you are not alone. You are seen. You are needed, not with urgency, not with demand, but with the same gentle certainty that carried her through fire and silence, through doubt and devotion, through the long nights when the world turned its back, and still she did not turn away. And perhaps that is why her story returns to us now, not in classrooms, not in battlefields, but in the quiet of night, when the world is still, when the mind begins to slow, when the heart opens just enough to let in a truth too soft for daylight. Because this is not a story of war. It is a story of listening, not of power, but of surrender, not of victory, but of faithfulness. And in that faithfulness, something eternal took root not in monuments, not in books, but in the quiet courage of those who, when no one is watching, choose to do what feels true, even if it makes no sense to the world, who remain kind when scorned, gentle when hardened, certain when doubted, not because they are unbreakable, but because they have learned to trust what they feel, even when the world says it is impossible. You may never raise a banner in the dark. You may never climb a broken ladder. You may never stand before a king and say, I was sent. But you may still hear something no one else does. A pull in the chest, a stillness in the mind, a knowing that cannot be explained. And when that moment comes, as it has come to so many before you, you will not need to be loud. You will not need to be certain. You will only need to listen, and then quietly to step forward, not because you know how it will end, but because you have learned to trust the voice within, the one that speaks not in thunder, but in breath, not in command, but in invitation, not to glory, but to purpose, not to conquest, but to care. We do not always know how a life becomes eternal. It does not happen in the moment of death. It happens in the quiet after, in the way a story is told, in the way a name is spoken, in the way a heart remembers what it felt when it first heard her voice. And in her gentle strength, in her unbroken faith, in her refusal to become what the world expected, we are reminded that the deepest legacies are not built with swords, but with stillness, not with noise, but with the softest of movements, like a single hand reaching out in the dark, hoping to be met, not with a shout, but with a breath, not with a crown, but with a quiet yes, spoken in the silence when no one is listening, and yet someone hears, not because the world has changed, but because one soul dared to believe in what it felt, and in that belief began to move, not toward power, but toward truth. She is not far from you, not in time, not in space. She is here, in the way the wind moves through the trees, in the way a candle flickers in a dark room, in the way a mother holds her child, in the way a stranger offers bread without being asked. She is in the quiet decisions, the unseen acts, the moments when no one is watching, and still you choose to be kind, to be brave, to be true. And in those choices, her life continues not as history, but as breath, not as legend, but as a quiet force that moves through the heart of those who have learned how to listen, who carry a light not to blind, but to guide, not to conquer, but to comfort, not to command, but to call gently into the dark, as she once did, not knowing who would follow, only knowing that she had to go. And so, as you lie here, as the world slows, as your breath deepens, as your thoughts begin to soften, you might feel it not a demand, not a command, but a gentle presence, like a hand resting on your shoulder, like a voice in the wind saying, "You are not alone. You are seen. You are needed, not to fight, not to win, not to be remembered, but to be here, to be present, to be true, to carry your own quiet truth forward, not because it is easy, but because it is yours, because the world, in all its noise and fear and rushing, still needs those who can listen, still needs those who can step forward without knowing the way, still needs those who can believe in what cannot be seen. Because the most powerful revolutions do not begin with armies. They begin in silence, not with thunder, but with a whisper, not with a sword, but with a soul that dares to believe in what it feels. And in that belief, in that quiet, yes, the world begins to turn not all at once, but slowly, like a leaf turning toward the light, like a river finding its course, like a heart remembering how to beat not for glory, but for grace. And so the echo remains, not loud, not urgent, but real. And it will keep whispering, not only in this story, but in the ones that have not yet been told, in the hearts that have not yet opened, in the nights that are still to come, in the dreams that are just beginning to form, in the silence between one breath and the next, where the voice that spoke to her so long ago still speaks, not to the world, but to you, in the quiet, in the dark, in the space where fear lets go and trust begins, where you are not asked to be perfect, not asked to be strong, not asked to change everything, only to listen, and to take one small step forward, just as she did. Because some stories do not end, they only change shape. They move from action to memory, from history to heart, from the past to the present, carried not in books, but in breath, in prayer, in the soft decision of one soul to listen, just as she had, and in that decision, across centuries, across continents, across the quiet moments before sleep, her voice still speaks, not in words, but in presence, not in sound, but in feeling, like a hand resting on the shoulder of a dreamer, reminding them that even now, even here, even in silence, they are not alone, and that the same quiet courage that carried her through fire and betrayal and loneliness still lives in those who choose to be gentle, to be faithful, to be true, not because they are certain, but because they have learned to trust the stillness within. And perhaps, in the silence of your room, in the stillness of your mind, in the quiet of your heart, you are already listening, not to a voice from the past, but to the one that has always been there, the one that does not shout, but whispers, the one that does not demand, but invites, the one that does not promise victory, but offers presence. And in that offering, in that soft, unbreakable thread between your soul and what you feel, you are already part of the same quiet current that carried her, not through triumph, but through faith, not through time, but through the eternal. And in that current, you are not alone. You are seen, you are needed, and your story, like hers, is already becoming something greater than yourself. Thank you for walking this path with her tonight, for stepping into a world so distant in time, yet so close in feeling, for letting the story of a girl from a quiet village settle into your breath, into your stillness, into the soft space between wakefulness and sleep. You have given this history a gentle home, not in facts or dates, but in presence, in attention, in the quiet act of listening, just as she once did beneath an oak tree, just as you are doing now, lying there, letting the world slow around you. Wherever you are listening from, whether beneath a city sky lit by distant lights, in a room warmed by candlelight, in a bed near the sound of waves, or the whisper of wind through trees, know that you are not alone. Thousands around the world have closed their eyes to these same stories, carried by the same breath, guided by the same longing to remember what it means to be human. If this moment of peace has touched you, if the quiet courage of her life has stirred something deep within, I thank you from the heart. And if you'd like to continue walking through time with us, consider subscribing. Your presence helps more souls find their way to this calm, to this warmth, to this gentle journey through the past. And if you feel like it, leave a comment with where you're listening from tonight. We read every one, like letters from old friends, like small lights in the dark, reminding us that even in silence, we are connected. Now, as the story fades into stillness, let yourself drift, not away from her, but deeper into the peace she carried, not the peace of victory, not the peace of silence after war, but the peace of knowing you have listened, you have stayed, you have not turned away. Let your breath slow, let your body soften, let your thoughts blur like stars seen through water. There is no need to remember every word, every name, every turn of the path. Only to know that something true has passed through you, like wind through leaves, like light through glass, like a voice that does not demand, but invites. And if, in the quiet of your dreams, you hear something, a whisper, a presence, a pull in the chest, do not be afraid. Listen, not with your ears, but with your heart. Because the same voice that spoke to her so long ago still speaks, not in thunder, but in breath, not in command, but in care, not to the world, but to you, in the silence, in the dark, in the space where love and courage meet. This is not the end. It is only a pause, because her story, like all stories that touch the soul, does not finish. It continues in the way you choose kindness tomorrow, in the way you trust what you feel, in the way you stay gentle when the world tries to make you hard. And when you are ready, whenever that may be, we will be here, walking together through other lives, other times, other quiet revolutions of the heart. So rest now. Let the weight of the day go. Let your mind wander where it needs to. And know, as you drift into dreams, that you are not alone. You are seen. You are needed. And somewhere, in the stillness, a girl in armor raises her banner not for war, but for you, softly, gently, quietly, in the dark. Good night.